Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Tuesday topic. Today's topic is Want Engagement, Promote Psychological Safety with our Assistant Dean for Experiential Learning and Innovation, Dr. Kate Morse. And now, without further ado, let me throw it over to you, Dr. Morse. Take it away.
All right, thank you, and welcome, everyone. I think that, it's interesting that the next Tuesday topic is around listening, because I think a lot of what we do around engagement and creating psychological safety is about listening to our learners as well. So I think that there's great connection in both of those, and I'm looking forward to that talk. Let me just make sure I'm on my slides. There we go. So this talk was designed by three of us and was actually recently presented at the National League for Nursing. And I've done some modifications, as we always do as we give talks repeatedly, but giving credit to my wonderful colleagues, Mary Fay from George Washington and Amy Daniels from the University of Maryland. Of course, we start every one of our talks and every one of our learning activities with the basic assumption where we believe that everyone participating in activities here is intelligent, capable, cares about doing their best, and wants to improve. And this is not just something that we say, this is something that we believe in the Simulation Center. And I want to hopefully connect the threads for you that this is something that you can utilize in many of your learning spaces, your classroom, whether it be online or in person, your simulation activities, your clinical activities, if you are doing clinical supervision. So this allows us as faculty to hold this about our students. This is not something our students have to earn. This is something that we give to our students, and it allows us, I think, the grace to be curious and respectful when we see things that are perhaps surprising to us and not what we expected our students to do, and that this belief allows us to get curious and understand what they're thinking or what their feeling was at the time that led them to make the decision that seems not quite in line with what our assessment was at the time. So this is something we also encourage you all to hold about yourselves, and we certainly have held this about ourselves in the past 2 years as we've been trying new things, failing, learning, adapting, because this allows us to be in that place of continuous improvement. So we hold it about everybody who comes to our sim space. We repeat it every time we work with you, we work with your students, and we try and hold it about each other, and that's how we work together as a team. We're not saying that this is easy. It sounds very nice and fluffy on the face of it, but it is quite hard when you're getting activated or you see something that you are surprised about. And that's when it's most important to be able to pick it up and hold it. So this is a key foundational concept around psychological safety. So my hope today is that I just open a door for you to think about using psychological safety, building, so creating and maintaining, and thinking about when we dip, how do we repair it? But thinking about that in your different learning activities, and that this is not something that should just exist in the Simulation Center, it should exist in all our learning spaces. So psychological safety, and many of you have probably had a lot of reading over this over the last few years, and I think everybody's pretty comfortable with the definition from Amy Edmondson, which it was originally designed through her research in business and then extended into the healthcare arena as she looked at high-performing, highly reliable teams and the OR, the ICU, and the NICU. And she defined psychological safety in teams as a team environment where team members felt comfortable to take interpersonal risks. And specifically, that means that team members are comfortable speaking up when they have a different perspective than the person who's leading the team, sharing when they don't know the answer, asking questions, discussing mistakes openly, and that allowed, and all with with no risk of retaliation, shame, or future, detriment on their moving forward in a professional stance. So in a learning environment, I'm saying to you that you all are learning leaders, whether you're you're the leader in the classroom, the leader in the simulation space, in your clinical space. So in a sense, our teams are where we are with our learners are those teams, and that is the psychological safety within the learning space. So the conceptual links are pulling it over. We're just happen to be a different team. We're not focused on delivering healthcare, but we're focused on delivering education. With that said, there are some, I think, still people who believe when they hear psychological safety, they think, oh, that's, we can't have any judgment. It's a judgment-free zone. We don't talk about poor performance. We just ignore it. We have to withhold our honest feedback because it's about being nice. And we avoid uncomfortable conversations, and it's soft and fluffy. And Vic Brazel, who's done a lot of thinking around simulation in situ, so translational simulation with active teams in the hospital, did a great podcast talking about psychological safety is not about being soft. It's about arming us with the skills to have the more difficult conversations. And those difficult conversations is allowing us to be able to talk about mistakes, to talk about when things didn't go well, to help people get better, to hear different perspectives than we have as the learning leader. And we may have something to learn here. We do not have the corner on the truth, even though we may have that perspective as the expert in the room, that, truth is often depends on your perspective. So what psychological safety is that belief that the team can take those risks and discuss mistakes and discuss difficult things. And it doesn't mean we let things go. We are able to admit ignorance, uncertainty. I didn't know what the right thing to do was that time. I didn't know where we were going. I was confused. Discussing failure and approaching failure from the perspective of problem solving versus it's the end of the line. So this idea of failing, learning, and improving is where the path we should be on versus failing and done. And when we think about, certainly we do have summative evaluations in our programs, and we're drawing a very bright line about when we're in a summative evaluation time and when we're in a formative evaluation time. And we can still create psychological safety in a summative evaluation space. But we need to be able to discuss failure. We need to be able to teach our learners in whatever specialty they are going forth in to be able to lead conversations and discuss mistakes, ask questions, admit ignorance, seek feedback. So as the learning leader, as the faculty in the room or the senior faculty in the room or the debriefer in the room, asking for feedback from the learning team, from your students. How is this conversation going for them? Are we in the right space? Do we need to switch topics? How are the questions landing on you? So seeking feedback. So in a pictorial kind of way, it's not the nice soft bunny, and yet it is a space where there is authenticity and people can bring their authentic selves and have authentic, true conversations. It's not about sugarcoating the feedback, but it is about holding the learners in high regard and to high standards simultaneously. And if we do that in the setting of holding the basic assumption, we can approach and have those difficult conversations to help all of us get better. It doesn't magically happen, so it requires deliberate practice by the faculty, by the learning leaders. And it just doesn't happen because we say this is a safe space. So we, as the learning leaders, have to model, invite, remodel, shift when it's not working, figure out how to repair and partner with our learning team. But telling them this is a safe space is like telling an adult, oh, don't be upset, don't be mad, don't be upset. And typically speaking, adults don't like it when you tell them what their emotions should be. And they are going to, it's their decision to assess us and decide whether or not we are providing a safe space. So I try never to have that in my language around saying, this is a safe space. I see my job as the learning leader to create, to invite, to refresh, to readjust, and to deliberately work at it. But I don't see it as telling somebody and thinking that that makes it so. And recognizing that what's safe for 8 of the people in your learning group may not be safe for the other person who's there. So it varies depending on what they bring into the learning space. Where are they coming from? What experiences have they had? So it's not one size fitting everybody. So we, as the learning leaders, have to be willing to sort of shift, assess, check in, and see how this is working for everyone who's in our learning space. What it is, and I love this picture of the water that seems like it's fluid and almost a band, but it's flexibility on the part of the learning leader. So I may have a plan of creating psychological safety. And as I'm going through that plan with my group in the beginning of the day, and I'm looking around at the faces and I'm recognizing something's not working here. So my job is to pause and check in and see what's not working, and being willing to be flexible and recognize that my plan may not be working for them, and we need to come to a better agreement so that we can move forward in a way that is going to engage people in learning, because that is the biggest educational payoff of engaging learners in psychologically safe learning experiences is deep learning. It does require reflection. And if we're on the bottom left-hand side of the screen, it does require reflection on my part as a facilitator and as a teacher to think about, okay, well, what went well in that class? We used the basic assumption at the beginning. We checked in with the learners multiple times. We partnered about how we were going to learn together. That all seemed to work well. What didn't work well was when we set them up to go out to do their work in their breakout groups. And it seemed to fall apart a little bit, and they didn't feel comfortable sharing out what we were hoping they were going to talk about. So thinking about engaging in reflective practice ourselves as educators. And we know that if the teacher is engaging in reflective practice, then the students are much more likely to engage in reflective practice. And finally, the picture on the right-hand side of the slide, which is a representation of the Japanese art of the kintsugi. And that is where, when there's broken ceramics or pottery, that it is repaired with a gold alloy or silver or platinum alloy, and the bowls are recreated. And they are not the same as they were before, but they are different, and they are more beautiful, and they're actually strongest at where they were broken. And the reason I use that analogy is sometimes psychological safety dips, or it doesn't work for one person. And we, as the learning leaders, have to recover it. And we can, and it requires us to be demonstrating humility, be inviting feedback, engaging in deliberate practice. And I think that it makes us a better educator, a better simulationist. And, I feel like for me, it's made me a better person. But this idea that we're all perfect is really not going to work, right? So I think if we engage working with failure and figuring out when things don't go right, how do we deal with that? And I just really love this philosophy around kintsugi, because I think it speaks to the fact that we learn so much from when things don't go well, and we can become better for it. So I mentioned earlier sort of that dynamic tension between the team psychological safety and the individual psychological safety, and not making the assumption that because I'm or whoever is the learning leader in the classroom, in the clinical space, in the simulation space, is engaging in all the behaviors that we know from the research that help promote psychological safety, that doesn't necessarily mean that works for every individual who's in that room. So recognizing that this is a dynamic tension and that psychological safety is not like a current construct that doesn't change throughout the learning environment. I think that it has to be refreshed. It has to be paid attention to in a deliberate manner, and recognizing that what is working for some may not work for all. So what I'd like you to do now is think of a time when you had a learning experience which you did not feel psychologically safe. Could be in an academic setting, could be in a recreational learning experience, but something that was a semi-structured learning experience where you did not feel psychologically comfortable and able to take interpersonal risks. And love for you to either come off mute and share a little bit of what that impact was on you, and or you can type it in the chat. So give you a moment to think back to that. All right, so if you have something in mind, thinking about what was the impact on you as the learner in that experience, and I would love to hear from you. So, oh, there you are, Katie.
Sorry, I can't see myself. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. Let me just put my camera on. Apologies. So I am just thinking about an example. I worked in the operating room for 4 weeks, and it was only 4 weeks for many reasons. If anyone works in nursing now, there's lots of orientations and residencies. But I was working at a really great top hospital, and they just kind of threw me into the operating room, circulating in a case. And my preceptor was going to do other stuff for the surgeon, leaving me in the room where, I felt very unsafe in many ways. But really that fear of speaking up, saying that I wasn't comfortable. And, in that type of situation, there was a lot at stake. It was a very high risk environment. But it was really, it was a lot on me, which is why I was only in the operating room for 4 weeks. But I came out on the other end okay and found, a place that worked better for me. But I just think that I was kind of set up for failure. And definitely, at that time, this is, oh my God, almost like 20 years ago, didn't really know the term psychological safety.
Right.
But
Yeah.
definitely felt unsafe. Never really said anything. I just said it wasn't for me, and that's why I left. And in hindsight, other nurses could have gone through the same experience. So I obviously should have, spoken up for myself and also for them.
And I think perhaps you're being harsh on yourself because you were in a very vulnerable position as someone who was not experienced, and sort of relying on, the people who are more experienced to create this learning environment for you. So the big impact was you didn't stay, but you didn't feel safe in the environment. So that's a very poignant example, and thank you for sharing that. Others, love to hear from you. Flossie's saying, in a situation where most people know each other and I do not, and this sense of inside jokes and et cetera, so not feeling equally valued, maybe, Flossie, or sort of invited into the team.
Correct. Yeah. Just feeling like I wasn't part of the group, part of the clique. And, it makes you feel like you just don't, it just feels too kind of scary to participate then, I might have a different perspective than everyone else in the room,
Mhm.
that might not be acceptable.
And you're not having a good sense of, right, because you're not invited in to know what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, or to share a different perspective. So I'm
Right.
guessing you didn't share anything then.
Correct. And yeah, it's almost like an inadvertent sort of, like they were having fun with each other, but here was like one or two of us that just didn't really know the jokes or whatever. So so yeah, it just feels kind of unsafe for the one new person,
Mm-hmm.
the two new people, when there are others who feel pretty cohesive.
Right. So that inviting into the team environment when someone new comes into the class, or groups reform.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, like I think about that in the learning groups. If there's been like a couple of people who stay together as groups reform, or you're the one new person in the group as the group reforms, that can have a substantial negative impact. Excellent. So let's flip the coin. Sorry if I could find my clicker. And there's my little picture of not feeling psychologically safe. So the tester's saying to the candidates, for fair selection, everybody has to take the same exam, and he's asking them to climb the tree. And obviously not a level playing field for the fish and the seal and the elephant and the penguin, and the monkey's got a leg up on everybody. So sometimes it's unintendedly so unsafe, but nonetheless, it still has an impact. So the other side of the coin is thinking about a time in an educational setting when you did feel psychologically safe, and how did that impact you? What was the impact for you as a learner? What were you able to do that you weren't able to do in unsafe situations? So think back to that time, and then love to hear from you either in the chat or just come off mute. Oh, and Katie's saying she's always felt psychological safe during simulation. So Katie, when you're as faculty or as a learner?
Oh, sorry, I'm thinking as a learner.
Okay.
I always felt like not afraid to speak up. It just felt like, I know we always say the simulation lab is a safe learning environment, but it always really felt that way beyond, doing clinical skills, but also just felt like we were all supporting one another, and it was okay to, speak up, ask questions, not feeling like you'd be an outsider and alienated if you did something wrong or asked the wrong question.
Mm-hmm. So that helped you you mentioned that helped you to be able to speak up so you could share different perspectives.
Right.
Great. Okay. Love that. And really, really important if we're trying to work with our learners to help shift their thinking, whether it's role socialization into their new graduate role, or they're becoming, their core professional through their undergraduate training. But we are asking them to shift how they view the world. And if they don't feel comfortable speaking up and sharing what they're struggling with, or that they have a different perspective, then we're not working, we're sort of living on the surface and talking about task-oriented activities. And we need to do both, equally valuable, and we need to do both. So wonderful. Excellent. Thank you, Katie, for sharing that. All right. So while the rest of you are thinking about that, let's talk about, for us in simulation, there is a tool that helps us assess how well the facilitator is doing at enacting psychological safety. So engaging in the behaviors in simulation that we believe from the literature are the ones that are most important to create psychological safety. And I'm going to make the argument and the connection that this cuts across all learning experiences. And I think, as we go through them, it'll make sense to you. So the elements, so the debriefing assessment for simulation in healthcare is an agnostic tool for assessing debriefings. So it comes from the Center for Medical Simulation, who are also the progenitors of debriefing with good judgment, but it is not intended for only use with that model of debriefing. You can use it in any debriefing. So element one is when we start to create an engaging learning environment. And element two talks about, as faculty and facilitators, how do we maintain an engaging environment? Now, the entire tool has 4 other elements that talk about how we conduct debriefing, but we're really only interested for our purposes in the first 2. And the first one talks about clarifying course objectives, orienting learners to the environment, talking about any confidentiality, setting expectations of what's going to happen and what our roles are. So when we think about this in the classroom setting, and we do a course overview, that is your pre-briefing. And your pre-briefing should clarify what the expectations of the course are. Just like when people come to the simulation space, they should know what the expectations are. Why are they here today? What are they trying to achieve? And we talk about the environment in simulation. We talk about physical safety and being oriented to the mannequin, etc. Same thing when we're talking about the environment in the learning space. Are we in person? Are we online? Are we a little bit of both? How does this work? If we're in the clinical space, what's the environment? When is a good time for feedback? How do we contract around that? Who gets to know about how well you're doing in the course? Who will I as faculty talk to if I have concerns? Do I come to you first, get permission? So we do all these things. We're just pulling it and looking at it through the lens of psychological safety. And we talk about roles, like what is my role as your learning leader in a didactic course? So my job is to help you understand the material, to facilitate conversations, to move you forward in achieving, becoming a nurse, becoming a physical therapist, becoming a therapist, and being really transparent about what my role is and what their role is. So if I'm showing up to class every time, I'm inviting them and expecting their role is to show up prepared to class and have done the pre-work so that they can engage in the learning as deeply as possible, and to ask questions and to push back when things don't make sense, and then talk about what the expectations. We clearly, fiction contract is something that's unique to simulation, where we talk about engaging, that we have done our best to create a space that is as real as possible to engage the learner actively in participating either as a nurse or a therapist or a physical therapist, and recognize that there are some limitations to that. And we ask them to come halfway and meet us with that so that there's deeper learning that can happen. And in a way, when we talk to our learners and we're asking them to be engaged and come to the classroom as prepared as possible, to have engaged with the work ahead of time so that we can be working at the application deeper level, not just handing over knowledge, we are creating that meaning maker role with them. So in a way, it's not the right label of fiction contract outside of simulation, but it's creating an agreement about how you're going to work together. Same thing if you're setting up and following them in clinical. This is your pre-conference. So all these elements apply in the pre-conference, just like they do in simulation. Talking to them about logistic details. When is class? How do they get there? What should they bring? What are the expectations of, hey, listen, we all need to have our cameras on the first 10 minutes of class while we do check-ins. Then, while we're doing a mini lecturette, you can have your cameras off. And then when we go back to doing group work, I'm going to ask everybody to put their cameras back on so we have engagement. Or if we're working in small groups in the classroom, what's the logistic details around that? What's your stance on people having their phones in the classroom, using their phones in the classroom? What's your, what is the process? Are classes recorded, not recorded? All those kinds of logistic things. So I'm hoping you're hearing transparency in learning, and transparency in the process and learning creates psychological safety. All while doing what you all do expertly, which is conveying a commitment to respecting the learners and understanding their perspective. And even when we're teaching them foundational knowledge, they come with a worldview that's going to influence how they interact with the material, whether it's, where they went to school, what their prior courses were in terms of getting them prepped to come to pathophysiology, taking anatomy and other different places that will have them prepared at a different level, and engaging with them, that our job is to get them all to the same level by the end of the course that we're teaching. So transparency in learning, and you're establishing psychological safety. So in simulation, this is what we would call our pre-briefing. In our class, it's our course overview. In clinical, on the nursing side, we use the word pre-conference, but I'm sure there are slightly variations on a theme when you're working with other active learning students in the clinical environment. So I want to pause here and see, what questions you might have, comments. Yes, Flossie.
Yeah, this might be off track a bit, but I'm wondering in a class or maybe a small class, if, part of me was thinking, well, maybe this, all of the learners, like it's a collaborative sort of definition of like what would make this a safe space for taking risks. And yet then I'm wondering, well, when do you do that? Because in the beginning of class, they might not feel safe to do that. Or do you just assume that it's a developmental process and what feels safe in the beginning, that might change by the 6th or 7th class?
Yeah, that is such a great, so I think that I will tell you the lessons from simulation that cross over and please anyone else speak up from other specialties. So having some shared agreements about how you're going to work together, whether you want to call them, shared agreements, ground rules, and to just start with, yes, love that. And, it is designed by them and then transparently talked about, well, what does that look like? And then it's something that you check in. And, when we do week-long simulation courses on the professional development side, oftentimes we'll do that. And then we might check in, 2 or 3 days in, are we still on the right path? Has anything changed? In your small learning group, if you're staying in an intact group, have those guardrails evolved at all for you?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Shared agreements. That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Kate.
I love that. And I think it engages, they have agency in this. And I think sometimes it's that juxtaposition, particularly with undergrads, of technically they're adult learners. And yet they're transitioning out of pedagogy into andragogy, and I know everyone, collectively, myself included, sort of tries to find that balance of, well, they need to take responsibility, and I'm proposing we need to be more transparent about that.
Right. Right. Well, yes. Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah, that's great. Because I think they have plenty of good ideas. We just don't listen to them. Element two is all about relationship building. And as we know, learning is a social construct, and the relationship that we have with our learners, whether it's in simulation, clinical, the classroom, is really important to how it is that they learn. And it is this relationship that we continue as we go through whatever that learning environment is. And that means that we continue to clarify the learning objectives. And I think for me as a faculty member, the shift in my belief is that if I tell them something once, they will get it. And that's not a fair assumption, because when we are talking to our learners, whether it's in sim or other spaces, they have a whole lot going on for them as they're coming into a class, whether it may be anxiety over their possible success, it may be the import of the class in their ability to move forward in their program. And of course, we're all informed by our last experience. So I'm currently teaching undergraduate pathophysiology and talking to the students about their level of stress and how that interferes with their ability to learn. And a lot of those things are external stressors on success and, having changed their life to do an accelerated program. But what is the takeaway for me as a faculty member? I need to refresh what our plan is, where we're going, what our roles are, and what the expectations are every time we meet, because they may not have heard it the other times or been able to listen and process because they were emotionally engaged. And we know when we're emotionally engaged, our working memory doesn't work so well because it gets flooded with cortisol and other hormones, and our cognitive load goes way up. So this idea that telling somebody once and expecting that they get it, and I used to be the queen of thinking that, I'm like, that just doesn't, there's not good science behind that, and it's a false belief. So it helps me immensely to be able to say, okay, so we're refreshing where we are. We're refreshing how we're going to work together. And for us in simulation, we're helping them engage with the problems that they saw, the clinical problems that they saw, recognizing they're working with a plastic doll at times. And in the classroom, we're helping them engage with material that in some of the foundational courses may seem far removed from what what their clinical practice is. And it's hard for them to kind of connect the dots of, well, how in the world am I going to use understanding how the kidney works in my clinical practice? So part of our job is to help connect those dots for them. And then just continuing to convey respect for them and concern for their psychological safety. So pausing, checking in, if we're not hearing a lot of conversation, not seeing a lot of questions, pausing, making sure that there's not something that we're missing, that there is an opportunity to check in. Have we gone, off the rails of psychological safety? And we need to sort of come back in. And by inviting and listening and adjusting when and where we can so that we are meeting the learners where they are. And, it's very hard when we have a curriculum and we have outcomes, and that feels like a lot of pressure on us as faculty. And that sort of drives where we're going. So how do we pause and stay in the space that's most helpful for the learners? And I think keeping foremost in our mind of using psychological safety to increase learner engagement, which means that at the end of the day, they're going to be more successful in the course or the simulation or the clinical experience. So I mentioned earlier this idea of creating psychological safety, maintaining psychological safety, and then repairing psychological safety, because we all will have dips because we are well-intended, and our intentions are never to, we don't intend get up in the day and say, today I'm going to make my classroom unsafe for my learners. So our intent is always laudable, but occasionally our impact is not. And that may be something we're bringing, that may be something they're bringing, but recognizing that and working to repair it is part of that dynamic process. If you're interested, there is a wonderful article written by a number of authors. The lead author is Michaela Colby, who talks about the dynamic nature of psychological safety in simulation, and a lot of the principles go everywhere, which includes things like, matching our verbal and nonverbal activities as an educator, naming the dynamic when there's something going on that's not serving the educational goal in the classroom, whether it's distractedness, whether it's disrespect between team members or students that are influencing our entire learning space. So this idea of repairing, super important. And I'm happy to send anybody the article if you're interested in that. The creating and the maintaining, the creating is that element one of how we start that process, your pre-briefing, your course introduction, your pre-conference, and then maintaining it throughout the educational space. And that doesn't mean that we as faculty are perfect, because we're human beings and we're not. So we are going to model fallibility because we're going to make mistakes. And we are going to model how we recover from those mistakes, because that is a really important skill for our learners, because they will also make mistakes. And how we treat ourselves and how authentic we are ourselves with those errors are really important to them being able to trust us as authentic teachers. So this work is from Amy Edmondson, and sort of pulled and coalesced from her book, Teaming, and talking about setting the stage, inviting participation, and responding productively. So when we think about it from the learning perspective, you can see the goals down on the bottom of the screen, that sharing expectations and meaning how do we talk about errors? How do we talk about uncertainty? How are we working together, faculty and student and student, and recognizing, hey, this may evolve over the class, this may change over the simulation, and we're going to need to check in with each other and make sure that it's still working for everybody. Demonstrating situational humility. None of us know everything, right? And I think being comfortable with making mistakes is a really important skill. It is not always happiness, and it's frustrating with yourself. And I keep thinking, when I do make these mistakes and I do model for my learners, I'm hopefully arming them with the idea that, yes, you will make mistakes in whatever your given profession is. You will need to model being transparent about them and being, demonstrating humility and asking for help. I'm being your poster child right now, so modeling fallibility, and helping them see that yes, it's a work in progress. Practicing inquiry. You guys are really good at asking good questions, exploring what your learners are thinking, and setting up structure and process, because consistency and clarity promotes psychological safety. Just like when we, for example, get sick, one of the biggest reasons that families experience substantial stress and critical illness is a lack of information. So and the same thing goes for learners, if the learners perceive that it's confusing, there's not clarity in expectations, they don't know when to go, where to show up, how they're being evaluated, then they are not going to they're not going to feel psychologically safe. And then responding productively, which is that goal and that orientation towards continuous learning and being a learning partner, meeting the students where they are, and that we all still have something to learn as well. And yes, in this setting, we are the learning leader, and I'm still going to have something to learn from you all, and I'm going to be better for it at the end of the day as well. Destigmatizing failure, obviously really important in simulation. And I think also in our other courses, to help learners think about feedback in a way that helps them be better, and that it's not failure, it's learning, adapting, and moving forward. So classroom exploring and clarifying thinking, no such thing as a mistake, no such thing as a bad question. In simulation, we want you to make zone mistakes. And we just did Sims all day today with our graduate students and talked about this in their pre-briefing. Like, we get very excited when people make mistakes here, because this is the perfect place for us to help you puzzle through how you got into that square that you don't particularly want to be in, and we can help you get out of it. And the same thing in the classroom. If you're making mistakes, if you're not if you didn't do well in an assessment, how we can help you develop and improve. And then in clinical, of course, is all about preventing mistakes and recognizing that they still happen, and that it's being authentic and honest about them, and understanding, the contribution from a system standpoint, because it rarely is an individual problem. So the toolkit, setting the stage, we already talked about this, shared expectations. You can see adding on that confidence that every voice is welcome, different voices are welcome. We're engaging in exploring other perspectives, and the orientation towards continuous learning. So this is, I think, as faculty and as simulation peeps, this gives us a toolkit to be able to bring psychological safety into any learning space that we have. I will say that crossing over all the stuff that we do in sim and we value in sim into the classroom has made my classrooms so much better, and helped me engage with my learners, bring more clarity in how we're working together. And I think it has really informed, I hope, them having a better experience. So how do we do this? And this is where I'm going to turn to you. And we put in the chat, and we gave you the script. So this is an example script that we use here in the simulation space. And what I want to do is I want to invite you to amend this for your individual learning space, so that Katie's pre-briefing sounds like Katie, Banny sounds like Banny, and we're working in our authentic voices. And it shouldn't, the elements should stay the same. If you're in the classroom, obviously fiction contract is going to be slightly different. And you should be talking in your own voice. So, no one's going to sound like me, and I don't sound like Lauren when we give pre-briefing, because we're different people. But having this structure so that we are all speaking to the same structure and beliefs of how we introduce learning spaces, I think helps us be consistent and helps the students, nirvana in Kate's world is that we are having the same kind of learning conversations with inquiry, with the same type of language in the classroom, in the simulation space, and in the clinical space, so that learners are having an expectation of being engaged in a way that is going to help them result in deep learning. So want to put this, you have this in the chat, pull it down, and love to hear from you all. What are you doing in your classrooms, in your simulation spaces? Is this consistent with what you're thinking? And get some feedback on this structure. So I'd like to give you a minute to open that up, but it's exactly the same that's on the slide. Right, so in our last few minutes, I would love to just open and hear any questions, comments, or what questions do you have for me? I'm trying to change my language because we were talking about this in a sim course the other day, that when we say any questions, you're sending the message that you really don't want any questions. But if you ask what questions people have, that's more inviting. So I'm working hard to change my language. So what questions do you have for me? Katie.
I actually don't have any questions. This was great though. I like how you, I think someone else said this, how like thinking about a pre-brief, not just from a simulation, but from like when you're starting a course, when you're, these are all, I think, great takeaways that regardless what role you're in or what kind of education you're doing, it could be patient education if you're, a student. I think that this is a nice way to frame it. So I think it's great. So thank you for this.
Oh, you're welcome. So I encourage you, Katie, take this, because I know we've worked in the online space with your simulations, but so take it and think about like, what would Katie sound like doing the pre-briefing, and think about how you would modify it, for your courses.
Yeah, that's great.
What other questions or comments? Flossie.
Yes, I have I guess it's more of a comment, but when I've had students, let's say, come to the sim lab, they are pretty pretty anxious, and so I guess I've been circling back, towards the end of this, I've been circling back to what you said originally, where like safety versus comfort, and how like a certain amount of anxiety might happen with learning, or anticipation might happen with learning, and yet, so how, I guess the rhetorical question is, how do we provide a safe space where a person or a group can tolerate discomfort or anxiety?
Yes. So in my doctoral work, which is about transformation, that's a shocker, right? So the one of my qualitative comments from one of my students was, I learned how to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. And I use that all the time in my pre-briefings and talk to people.
Yes.
Learning and change. It's not, you're not, the whole reason you change is because you are uncomfortable. Otherwise, we go along and think, hey, I'm fabulous.
Right.
So
not learn anything.
Yes. So we expect you to be a little uncomfortable, and that's okay. I don't want you to be so uncomfortable that you turn to me and you say, I don't know my name, because then we've crossed into a space where you are not able to engage.
Right. Freeze. Yeah.
Yeah. So I do talk, I do normalize it. It's completely normal to feel anxious at the beginning of a course or at the beginning of a clinical. And let's talk about, what does that look like and how can we use that to our advantage? Because ignoring it's not going to work.
Right.
You're going to have to deal with this in real clinical life, whatever that may be for you. So yes, I think just normalizing being transparent and saying, yeah, this may not always be completely comfortable. And, we are right here with you.
Great.
Yeah.
Great. That's a great way to put it. Okay. Thanks, Kate.
Yeah, you're welcome. And I'm seeing multidisciplinary, yes, collaboration. Banny, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Please correct me if I'm not. I should have known this, or the hesitation. Yeah, so I love that. So in the interprofessional space and in interprofessional learning, just like in interprofessional practice, I think there's a lot more pressure at times about hierarchy and roles. So that's where, thinking back to Amy's work that was done in interprofessional high performing teams, that was where it was, I think, even more important that the leader normalized, invited, tolerated different perspectives, and valued and asked and invited repeatedly, and it can't just be once. And I think that, it's not a one and done. It's like, you can't say it's safe and then you're done and you're like, check. You have to keep reflecting on it and checking in with your participants. So I think you're absolutely right. It is really challenging in an interprofessional, and we're all struggling with how best to educate in that space because of the complexity of scheduling, et cetera. And we know, we have to arm our students with those skills to go out and work in teams, because healthcare is a team sport. So we're not there yet. We haven't figured it out, I don't think, entirely, but it is incredibly important in those kinds of teams to have psychological safety. And Robin, you're saying, do I see an increase in anxious learning environments related to the COVID pandemic? I would say, and I don't, and I'm sure that there are some studies that I've not necessarily seen, but I would certainly say anecdotally that everyone could say to you that the level of anxiety with the students, because of whatever's going on in their personal realm, or if they're a graduate student and they are continuing to work in their clinical environment, and if that's in the hospital, then their personal level of stress and internal grief with the number of patients that they're lost impacts their ability to engage in learning. And we do talk about that. We talk about that on the graduate side. We talk about that when we work with professionals, when we're doing simulation courses, because it's there. Like, we can't just ignore it. So how do we help people how do we normalize it? How do we talk about it? And how do we support through it? As we see life moving forward, we don't want to leave our students behind. Nor do we want to graduate them and have them leave the profession, whatever that is, because that just breaks my heart. So I think, Robin, absolutely, for a multitude of reasons that I'm guessing we are not going to understand for years to come, the entire mental health impact around this. And I think that psych safety is important to that, and around creating learning environments that are inviting and supportive, and yet help them to see a different way or a different, professional life. So I'm also seeing, guys, that we're at 4:58, and Darren, I got there just before you popped on. So thank you for your attention. I mean, obviously, this is a topic that we're very passionate about in simulation, and really want to help have you guys think about it and infusing it in other parts of your learning lives. We would love to partner with you, and think about it, and write about it, and think about how do we help all of us collectively work in this space, and how do we work together as teams, as faculty, in a psychologically safe way, because we all have identities and they get into trouble too. So thank you so much for your time. Do reach out to me. You know where I live, and love to carry on the conversation. And thank you, Darren, for inviting me, and I appreciate the time.